you can get super busy doing all the newfangled stuff and the shiny, sexy stuff and forget about the basics. And the cost to you is more than what you want to pay if that is happening. So stay tuned if you don't mind. This is for your own good. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Inflammation Nation podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Steve Noseworthy.
One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases. And it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the Inflammation Nation. If you have been hooked into the longevity space these days, you've probably heard the recent news that Bryan Johnson, who is an entrepreneur and a biohacking guy, he has recently revealed that he was diagnosed with an incurable disease called autoimmune gastritis. And that's not really what this episode is about, but I think that his recent announcement gives us an opportunity to talk about some really important things. Now, the irony in this situation is that Bryan Johnson, he's become famous for spending millions of dollars every year to biohack his way into reversing his biological age to that of an 18-year-old. And I read somewhere that his philosophy, his mission is don't die, or something to that effect. I might be misquoting him, so forgive me for that. But, to my understanding, he has already been managing Hashimoto's disease since he was in his early 20s. And somewhere along the way, he adopted a plant-based diet. And the idea of a plant-based diet in someone who has an autoimmune disease may or not necessarily be the greatest thing. And I don't want to go off into too much of a bunny trail, but just know at a top level that plant-based foods contain proteins called lectins, and not all lectins are created equal, and not all people have problems with lectins. Within the context of autoimmune diseases, there are certain types of lectins, proteins found in nuts and seeds, beans, legumes, and other vegetables. There are some of these lectin proteins that can cross-react with human tissue, and this is pretty well studied and pretty well published. But going back to Bryan Johnson's scenario, his recent revelation really kind of outlines the idea that no matter who you are, no matter how perfect your metrics might look on paper, no matter how much money you spend or how advanced and sophisticated your longevity tactics and gadgets are, things can still go sideways, especially if your core biology glitches on you. I teach a wide variety of seminars to doctors in the world of functional medicine. And one of the core ones is what we commonly call functional blood chemistry analysis. And this is where we teach doctors to look at laboratory data, not through the lens of conventional medicine, which of course is about finding diseases to manage, but through the lens of function and health and wellness, and really kind of asking the question, like, how have you lost your wellness and how do we get that back? And that is a different thing than looking at lab data to find diseases to manage. And that's, I've talked about this before. It's just kind of a different conversation, but more to the point, quite often, and I'll do this essentially when there's a lot of doctors in the class that have never really looked at things that way. I mean, it could be half the room could be people who are already doing functional medicine. They may have done this course before, and they're coming back just to kind of bone up and do a refresher. But especially as the years have gone by over the last 15, 20 years, we're getting higher and higher proportions of docs from the conventional medicine side. So medical doctors, osteopaths, nurse practitioners, very common to have in our seminars. And it's the first time they're looking at lab data from this new perspective of health and wellness. And it's kind of cool because this is one of the reasons why I love to teach, is because I love to see the aha moments where a clinician realizes that there's like a whole world that he or she hadn't even considered existed. And now you can just see the excitement over doing things a different way. But quite often I will start the seminar out by using, and I borrowed this from a guy named Stephen Covey. If you have ever used or heard of the Franklin Covey day planners, that's the Stephen Covey I'm talking about. He also wrote the book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's not the only book he's written. And I borrowed an analogy that he uses in one of his books, and it's what I call the big rocks first story. And I use this in my seminars to help clinicians understand that when you look at someone's lab data, you have to have a system of prioritization. Like what's most important to look at first, what's most important to look at next, and what's most important in the overall context of human physiology, what we might call deal breakers, that if they're present, you have to fix those before you can expect anything else you're doing to work. For example, it's very common and let's just take Bryan Johnson's situation. Like, anytime he or anybody else is diagnosed with a thyroid problem, it's very tempting just to try to do thyroid stuff. And that might be like in the conventional world, of course, that would be thyroid hormone replacement. But in the natural medicine world, that can range everything from giving someone iodine, which again, for Hashimoto's probably not a great idea. Totally different conversation. Maybe I'll do an episode on that one day. It can be range anything from iodine to tyrosine. These are kind of very old school nutritional approaches to, using supplements that might affect the conversion of T4 to T3. But the reality is there are things that are more fundamental to how the thyroid functions that if you don't fix those first, no matter what thyroid specific protocols you're using, you're probably not going to get the results you're looking for. Back to the idea of the big rocks first. Here's how the story goes, and then I'll tie it together. But I think you'll get the picture as I get through. So imagine that, and I'm giving you my version of this, right? If you go back, if you find the book where that is, and I can't remember which of Covey's books this is in, and you read it, it might not read exactly like I'm going to give it to you today, but that's not the point. I'm not trying to quote things verbatim. But in the Big Rocks First story, imagine that there's a class of MBA students. They're getting ready to graduate, right? It's the final class of their entire degree program. They're getting ready to launch their careers, and the professor kind of says to himself, I don't want to just kind of do a standard closing lecture. So what he does, he brings a time management expert into the class just to help them, because he knows that time management is a skill that is important to success in general. So the guy comes in and says, hey, I'm not going to bore you with a lecture on time is important and so on. So we're going to do a demonstration project. And on the desk, he's got this big glass jar, and next to that, he's got these big rocks. And he said, we're just going to put as many rocks in the jar as we can until we can't fit any more in. And so he puts a big rock in, puts another one in. Maybe he moves those around to get a third rock in and so on. And eventually he can't fit any more big rocks in the jar. And so he asks the class, is the jar full? And everyone says yes, because of course you can't fit any more big rocks in. And he said, oh, okay. And he takes out a box or a bucket of smaller rocks, and he proceeds to put the smaller rocks in the spaces in between the big ones. And when he does that and gets to the point where he can't fit any more in, he asks the class, is the jar full now? And half the class says yes, and the other half says no. And so he goes through this process where he gets smaller rocks and gets down to pebbles. He might shake the jar to get them to fall down to the bottom so he can fit more in at the top. And then eventually he pours in sand and then water. And then when he got to the point where he truly couldn't fit any more into the jar, he said, how about now? And of course, everyone says, yeah, the jar is now full. And the point was really that when you're looking at budgeting your time for success, you have to budget time for the important things first, whatever that is to you. If it is your career, then you budget most of your time for your career. But if your family's important to you, it's important that when you look at your week, that you budget time to spend with your husband, your wife, your kids, and so on. So it could be your fitness, it could be, managing your finances. It doesn't really matter. The point is that when you go to budget your time, you have to start allocating time with the things that are most important first, because if you don't do that, then you're not going to have an opportunity to get to those things. Imagine if he had started with sand and water. He never would have gotten any of the rocks in at all. And so how does that translate to Bryan Johnson and you as an individual and the message that I'm trying to convey today? Well, first of all, I don't know Bryan Johnson. I don't know everything he does or doesn't do. All you can go on is what his public persona presents and the information that he allows to come through. So please give me a little bit of grace as I go through it. If I say something that sounds a little bit accusatory, I really don't mean it that way. But when you go to someone like Bryan Johnson, or let's just even take him out of the picture, just talk about the average healthcare consumer, especially those that are really hooked into the longevity space and biohacking and all this kind of stuff. Most people, they're majoring in the minors. Or to say it in another way, they started with the sand and the water and they forgot about the big rocks and putting those in first. with all of these different wellness strategies and, one-off supplements that are being sold and touted by influencers on the internet and all of the biohacking stuff, especially focused on longevity, that's the sand in the water. Right? When you're pursuing these tactics, whatever they might be, people using them they're kind of chasing deep cellular shortcuts. Like, let's say they're focused on autophagy, or the cell's ability to renew itself. They're focusing on these shortcuts before they've even cleared the big rocks, the root cause disruptors that are actually driving their brain fog and their chronic fatigue and their baseline physiological stress. And I've said it before, maybe in different ways, but you can't rely on a school grade definition of, say, nutrition to solve PhD level metabolic crises. And we have to be more discerning, and we have to have a hierarchy of physiology and some way to prioritize the big rocks over the sand in the water before dealing with the sand in the water even makes any sense, right? So we have to fix the specific content and quality and quantity metrics that are unique to you and your biology. And so, to the end of making sure that you prioritize the big rocks first, I want to go super high level today. And I want to talk about where longevity actually begins. And this is it's a simple, no-brainer, almost stupid stuff that we tend to gloss over because it's not sexy. It's not the shiny new thing that grabs everybody's attention. But the cost of ignoring the things we're going to talk about today, or not doing them well, or not doing them consistently, is going to cost you more to quality of life and longevity at a price that is higher than you want to pay, right? So I'm going to go through just some core concepts, and really what I'm going to share with you now, I'm pulling these statistics and these concepts from two major longevity papers that were published in the last, say, 5 years or so. And they were published in top tier journals, one called Circulation, the other one called British Medical Journal, BMJ. And understand that what longevity researchers often do, not all do it this, because you have longevity researchers that they're studying nematodes or worms or fruit flies or different fungal species in petri dishes in a lab. And that's how they're doing their longevity research. Others will do things like what these papers did, where they use reference data from two major long-term studies one is called the Nurses' Health Study, and the other one is the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. And kind of lumping these two together, they followed 329,000 people over about a 50-year time frame. And they collected all kinds of laboratory data, vital statistics and metrics. They looked at their health levels, their whatever diseases they were diagnosed with along the way, and what they died from if they died during that period of time. And they looked at like their diet and their lifestyle habits. And this is a massive database that researchers all over the world have access to try to answer questions like what if, and what is the impact of X, Y, and Z on mortality or morbidity, which is the symptoms that you suffer while you're living. And so what the analysis revealed, and again, this is kind of like no-brainer, stupid stuff, but if we never talk about it, it tends to get forgotten, which is why I want to talk about it. And just the other day when I saw this news article about Bryan Johnson, my first reaction was, yeah, I feel bad for him, because the autoimmune gastritis is among probably one of the harder autoimmunities to manage. And a lot of autoimmunities, like Hashimoto's, for example, can be managed quite well for most people, quite successfully. But there are a handful that kind of elude our grasp, if you will, meaning that if somebody has it, there's a much less likely probability that we're going to be able to help them with functional medicine. Doesn't mean we don't try. It just means that probabilistically, we're not going to get the same outcome with someone with, say, lupus and autoimmune gastritis than someone who has Hashimoto's disease, and that's the only thing that they have. So again, this is kind of the no-brainer, simple, stupid stuff. And you're gonna listen to me go through this, and you're gonna say to yourself, why am I even listening to this? Because I already know this. And I want you to stop yourself. If you're thinking that, and if your tendency is to shut this off because you've heard it before, I need you to not do that. You need you to not do that. Your spouse and your kids need you to not do this, because we tend to think of these things as kind of all or nothing things. But there are some lifestyle habits that we're going to talk about right now that people do intermittently, and even that has an impact. It doesn't mean, like, for example, smoking is one of the big ones. And someone might say, well, I'm a social smoker, I'm not really a smoker, or I only smoke once a month if I'm stressed, or whatever the case is. Well, even that has a metabolic cost for you. And again, I don't want you to think that how do I want to say this? I don't want you to think that I'm trying to dumb things down for you, because that's not the case at all. I am using the opportunity of Bryan Johnson's revelation in the context of who he is and what he has done over the last, decade or more, that he's been pursuing this idea of reversing his biological clock to that of an 18-year-old. I'm using this as an opportunity for you and I to refocus on the super big picture, to make sure that we don't work ourselves into a blind spot. What I mean by that is that you can get super busy doing all the newfangled stuff and the shiny, sexy stuff, and forget about the basics, forget about the big rocks, right? And the cost to you is more than what you want to pay if that is happening. So just kind of stay tuned if you don't mind. This is for your own good. So basically, the analysis that they did in these two papers surfaced 5 key low-risk lifestyle factors, or you could say high-risk lifestyle factors, depending on whether you're talking about doing or not doing these things that follow. But these low-risk lifestyle factors that define, let's say, the largest of the big rocks that you need to pay attention to and improve if necessary. Some of these won't apply to you. Some of these might have applied to you in the past. You might be thinking about changing some of these things. But the first thing is smoking. And in the ideal, nobody would ever smoke, because when you look at the habit of never smoking, is important to us, because smoking never smoking, I should say, is a powerful independent risk factor for cancer and diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. Now, mechanistically, smoking induces massive systemic oxidative stress and chronic inflammation. And these things directly damage your DNA, and they accelerate premature aging. They shorten your telomeres. I talked about this a while back, but telomeres are quite often talked about in the medical literature, and we can test for these things now as indications of your biological aging. But smoking places a massive strain and a catabolic drain on your systemic biology. And because of the nature of the impact on human function and what happens down at the tissue and the cellular level, smoking becomes one of the largest drivers of completely preventable premature death. I remember, I think it was last year, I did a series on like the cholesterol myth. Can't remember what I called it. Pardon me, but we were talking about in one of the episodes how statin drugs didn't come to market until the early 80s. I think it was 81 or 82, 1981 or 82. And prior to that, in the late 60s and 70s, there was actually a massive decline in the rates of cardiovascular disease and deaths from that. And it's not just having it. They actually track the deaths from cardiovascular disease. And the reason for that decline in the late 60s and 70s was because in the mid 1960s, the U.S. Surgeon General came out with the revelation that smoking causes heart disease. And so many people stopped, and because they stopped over the next decade or so, the rates of heart disease went down quite rapidly. In fact, you can look at epidemiological data, and you can look at how the graph or the slope of the curve of people who stopped smoking matches identically with the slope of the curve of the decline in cardiovascular disease. And, when it comes to smoking, your risk is directly proportional to how much you smoke and how long you smoke for. And those are two correlated, but those two variables, how much you smoke and how long you smoke for, they combine to give you kind of a wide range. You can, smoke very infrequently and not a lot, like you have 1 cigarette a month, for example, or you can be a 3-pack a day person that you've been doing that for 20 years. But even the combination of light smoking, even just a few cigarettes a day, over a long period of time can be just as damaging to someone who smokes heavily intermittently, right? And again, the problem with smoking as a lifestyle habit is the massive inflammatory and oxidative stress load that it puts on the system that your body has to match. And ultimately, just to kind of add one more thing here, is that when you deplete your antioxidant stores and drive a low-grade chronic inflammation, you can't handle the metabolic implications of being chronically inflamed with a lot of free radicals floating around damaging your cells and your DNA. You just can't handle it, which is why, like, you can easily spot someone who smokes, just like you can easily spot someone who spends way too much time in the sun, because their skin ages way beyond their chronological age, right? Skin is just, think of that rate of skin aging as an indication of how your organs are aging, because skin is an organ. It's just the organ we can see. So risk is directly proportional to how much you smoke and for how long. And maybe you're sitting there thinking, well, I don't even smoke a pack a day. But if you're smoking a few cigarettes a day and you've been doing that for 10, 15, 20, 30 years, that's a big problem and you need to stop. I don't feel bad about saying that at all. You need to stop. The interesting thing is about like when you stop smoking, you start to reap the benefits right away. Like within days, certainly weeks of not smoking, you can see cellular changes. We can't see it because we're not doing research in a clinical setting. But my point is things start to change within days and weeks. However, as encouraging as that is, to experience the full benefit of stopping smoking and to get yourself back to the point where you have the same risk for things like cancer and heart disease as someone who's never smoked in their life, that takes 10 to 15 years. Let that sink in. So if you're in that situation where you're like, well, you don't consider yourself a smoker because you only smoke on the weekends, or you smoke when you're at a party, or you're only smoking a few cigarettes a day just to kind of take the edge off, whatever reason it is, the longer you've been doing that, it's going to take you a decade to get over it once you stop. And that's no joke, right? That's a serious, serious deal. Right. I'll stop hammering that one. The second healthy lifestyle habit, and this is really not a habit, it's a more of a body metric, is having an optimal BMI or body mass index. If you've been listening to me for a while, you've heard me talk about this before. And it's helpful. It's got some drawbacks, but basically it's the BMI or the body mass index is calculated essentially as your weight in kilograms divided by the square of your body height measured in meters. That's the mathematical formula. But basically, it basically looks at your height and your weight as they relate to each other and gives us a numerical value that we call the BMI. And in general, anything that's, say, 30 and above is considered obese. Most experts say that the optimal BMI is, say, between, let's say, 18 or 19 and 25. Right? Once you get 25 to 30, that's a higher BMI. And we see in general a correlation with increased risk of disease. And the idea is that the higher your BMI is, the more obese you are. Right? You've got more weight compared to your height. Now, there's two caveats to this. And I said it can be a useful tool to look at your BMI, but it's pretty one-dimensional and it's blinded to body composition, right? So there's two caveats when you look at and calculate your own BMI. And you can just jump online, type in BMI calculator and it'll ask you to put in your height and your weight and it will give you a number. Right. And in an ideal world, it's somewhere between, let's say, 19 and 25. But here are the drawbacks. You can have a high BMI, as I do. My BMI is routinely about 29 or 30, and that's above what's considered optimal. But if the increased body mass you have for your height comes from muscle rather than fat, that's okay. Right. So I'm 6 feet tall-ish. Used to be a little over 6 feet. Now I think I'm a little under 6 feet. That's what happens when you get older. And I weigh about 225 pounds, give or take. And I'm not the most muscular guy in the world and certainly not the leanest guy in the world. But for my height, I have a lot more muscle on my frame than the average 62-year-old. And so a better metric than the BMI is what's called the fat-free mass index, or at the very least look at them together. The fat-free mass index, the FMI, is something that kind of asks the question, do you have enough muscle for your frame? And so if you have somebody with a high BMI and a good or an elevated fat-free mass index like I do, now I'm not concerned that my BMI is 29 or 30, again, depending on the day. And so you have to be a little bit more discerning. And as great as it is to read these papers and so on, we have to read these things with a critical eye. And because if you look at the BMI, you can run into problems in two different ways. You're going to have a high BMI and then falsely conclude that someone has a problem because you're not accounting for muscle mass. Or you can have a low BMI and feel, wow, I'm really great. I must have low risk because I have a low BMI. But what if your low BMI is because you have low muscle mass? And this is what we call, like commonly we'll call it skinny fat, right? You have somebody who looks small and thin, but when you examine them, they're mostly fat and very little muscle. Another term for this is called sarcopenic obesity. And this is a high risk state. And the reason why it's a high risk state, and what I mean by sarcopenic obesity, the word sarcopenic means muscle loss, right? And so someone can be obese without being overweight. And I guess that's really probably the best way to say it. You can have a normal scale weight. Your body size might be appropriate for your frame, but if you've lost muscle and most of your mass is body fat, that is a high risk state. And the reason for that is because muscle contributes to health. And I do know that I've done a couple of episodes talking about the importance of muscle and resistance training. And we're in an era of what I call muscle-centric medicine. And this is part of my approach clinically when I work with clients. Most of my clients are not exercising. Most of my clients need to add muscle mass in the form of lean, healthy, strong muscle. And so I routinely put together training protocols and programs for people because I understand the importance of muscle mass to their health. And a lot of people, again, they just need more muscle than what they have. And so the BMI itself is a little bit one-dimensional. I like to go beyond that, but just take it as this. The lifestyle habit that we're trying to say is that you need to have a healthy weight, which really has two dimensions. Minimize your body fat, maximize your muscle. That's the essential takeaway there. The next lifestyle habit that these papers focused on, and again, remember that this is looking at a database of over 300,000 people over a period of decades and looking to see, well, the people who are still alive and have good quality of life, what are they doing compared to the people who die early or have diseases? And one of these healthy habits was 30 plus minutes of daily moderate to vigorous physical activity. Simple. Again, no brainer and stupid stuff like, duh, you're telling me I need to exercise. Of course, I know that. Well, I have done several episodes. And if you're not listening, maybe if you're a new listener to the Inflammation Nation, you can go down through the episode list and look at all the different topics that we've talked about. I think at this point, I've got close to 190 different episodes. So there's a lot of information that I've already covered. And I'll probably cover these things again because, concepts get outdated and updated. And we just need to come back and talk about the core messaging over and over and over again about what does it take to be healthy and well. But when it comes to moderate to vigorous physical activity, let me dispel a couple of notions first, because I hear this a lot with new clients that I consult with. I might ask them if they exercise and they say yes. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And they will say I take my dog for a walk. Okay, well, how long do you go for? And what happens to your heart rate? And if I go out, I walk a mile, which is great. You're getting steps and that contributes to the overall picture. But they're just walking, the dog's stopping and sniffing. And so they're walking a mile is characterized by walking 10 steps and stopping for 30 seconds and going, walking to the next tree and stopping for 30 seconds. And then there's a flower. And so even though they're moving their body, it's not exercise, because to really qualify for exercise, we might say that it is a focused period of time where you're intentionally moving your body and using your body in ways that elevate your heart rate to a certain level. And so 30 plus minutes of daily moderate to vigorous physical activity. How do we define that? Well, moderate, and it depends on the paradigm you're using, and different people have different guidelines. So I'm just going to give you a general one. And that would be that you need to track your heart rate when you're moving around doing your stuff. Let's say that you're out working in your garden. I'm up in Eastern Canada for the summer, and my dad has a property across the road that's full of trees that he wants down. And so I might go spend a couple of hours with a chainsaw and an axe and cut down trees and cut their limbs off and stack them for 2 hours. And my heart rate stays up and certainly in an aerobic zone for the entire time. And that would be considered exercise. But walking your dog typically wouldn't be. Doing, most gardening is not going to qualify unless you're doing it very, very intensely. And my point is that the easiest way to figure out if you're in that moderate intensity zone, you could do it a couple of ways. One is your own rate of perceived exertion. This is kind of like the tried and true way. If you feel like you're working hard, because it's all relative to you and your capacity. But if you want some specific numbers, the easiest way is to look at your maximum heart rate. I should say your theoretical maximum heart rate, because it's a calculation, which is defined as 220 minus your age. So if you're 50 years old, 220 minus 50 is 170. And you want your heart rate to be around 75% of that, which again, for a 50-year-old would equate to about 128 beats per minute. And so, even if you're moving around for an hour, that's great. But if your heart rate's 100, if you're 50 years old and your heart rate's 100 and you really need your heart rate to be around 128, give or take, then that's just activity. It's not exercise. And this is one of the reasons why, gosh, we could build out an entire series just on this. But one of the reasons why exercise like this that elevates your heart rate is so important, I'll just give you one. It's the production of something called nitric oxide. And nitric oxide is it's a signaling molecule. Depending on the context, it could be classified as a neurotransmitter, also a hormone. But basically, it's a nitric oxide is a molecule that's produced in this context by the lining of your blood vessels as a result of turbulent blood flow across the surface of the lining of the blood or the blood vessel. So as your heart rate elevates, your blood flow becomes turbulent, and the things that are in your blood, like red blood cells and proteins and hormones, they kind of bang up against the inside lining of the blood vessel, and they trigger the production of this thing called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide in that local tissue area in the blood vessels protects the blood vessels from inflammation and disease and cholesterol deposits and plaquing and hardening of the arteries, and it protects you from cardiovascular disease. But that nitric oxide that's produced in your blood vessels can go anywhere. It can go into your brain, where it protects your brain from neurodegeneration and controls brain inflammation. And it can be used or produced even by the immune system, which is part of immune strategies to kill infections. And so exercise, again, simple, stupid, no-brainer stuff, but sometimes you know it, but knowing why it's important, or at least having a glimpse of that picture, might convince somebody to start a habit that they're not currently doing. And maybe you just need to simply re-examine what you think you're doing that qualifies as exercise and come to the realization that either you're spot on and you're doing what you need to do, or you're not and you need to make some kind of a change. So that was the next one. It was 30 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. The next one is moderate alcohol intake. Now, I want to dance a fine line here, because what I'm going to tell you is not optimal, right? There are experts right now that are saying there's no safe level of alcohol intake. And honestly, I'm not sure I'm convinced of that. I understand why they say it. But at the very least, and that's what I want you to understand, at the very least, what I'm going to give you right now is the threshold where you avoid the highest risk, right? If you're drinking more than this, what I'm going to share with you, then your first goal is to get down to these thresholds that I'm going to share. And maybe you have a next level goal of reducing that even further. But there's a very clear relationship in this collective decade to decade data that we've been talking about, that for women, your risk for heart disease and cancer and diabetes and obesity and all the bad things goes way down when you have no more than one standard drink per day or less than 7 per week. And a one drink per day would be defined as a 5-ounce glass of wine or a 1.5 ounce of a spirit like bourbon or tequila. Now that's, people go like, okay, I had a glass of wine, but the glass of wine is one of those big goblets that holds like 18 ounces. That's more than a glass of wine, right? So for women, the threshold is no more than one standard drink per day, defined as 1.5 ounces of a spirit or 5 ounces of a glass of wine. For men, it's no more than 2 of those. And again, I want to reiterate that that's probably not optimal, that you should probably be shooting either for no alcohol at all or shooting for less than that. And that also gives you the freedom to say, well, I'm not going to drink during the week, but I'm going to have a beer or 2 on the weekends. I think you're going to be in the same risk category if you do it that way. Again, stupid no-brainer stuff. Like, who doesn't know that excessive alcohol is a problem? But, we run into issues where we go, okay, well, we don't understand what excessive alcohol means. And we also don't understand whether or not it means that I can't have something every day or I can't drink just on the weekends, and kind of bundle things together. So again, my point in this with the alcohol is these thresholds are not optimal. It just means it's where you see the biggest reduction in risk, and reducing your alcohol intake even beyond that should probably give you even more benefit. But you get to decide whether or not those additional restrictions are worth the incremental changes. At the very least, get yourself down to these thresholds where you're having no more than 1 drink per day if you're a woman, no more than 2 drinks a day if you're a guy. That sounds like an awful lot to me personally, but I have a 2 drink limit no matter any time I drink. All right, the final one is high diet quality. So let me just go back and kind of read through so you can get them in a list. The first low risk lifestyle factor is never smoking. The second is having an optimal BMI, and I threw in there the fat-free mass index. The third is having 30 plus minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity or exercise per day. The fourth one was moderate alcohol intake. I think you should shoot to 0 to low. And the final one is high diet quality. And this one is actually quite subjective. If you ask, let's say you take a dozen people off the street and ask them what a healthy diet is or a high quality diet, you're going to get different answers. And that's okay, because I think we as humans have a wide tolerance to adopt different dietary patterns without running into problems. And it's very difficult to offer a one-size-fits-all diet that's going to work for everyone, right? Some people are going to say a high quality diet is plant-based, right? Just become a vegan or at least a vegetarian. Others will swing in the opposite direction and say, no, you need meat. Let's go all the way to the extreme that the best human diet is the carnivore diet. And yeah, there's probably people in each of those extremes that are going to do well with those approaches. I think for most people, the ideal diet lies somewhere in between there, right? And so what I like to do with my clients, at least when we start out, because for me, discovering their ideal diet it's a process, but we have to have a reasonable starting point first. And my starting point for most people is the paleo diet. Skip the junk, no fast food, eat whole foods, stay away from packaged foods. But they also have to understand how many calories they need and what is an optimal macronutrient profile for them. How much protein do they need? And once we account for the calorie contribution of protein to your total calorie intake, how do we split the rest of the calories between protein and fat? Do we go high carb, low fat, low carb, or some blend and mixture, the old zone diet, which was roughly equal carb and fat from a calorie standpoint, at least? Everyone's a little bit different. And so I find myself in clinical practice using the paleo diet as a beginning template in terms of the content of food that people eat. Like, what do you eat? What do you avoid? But I find myself, when it comes to high carb, low carb, I find myself recommending different things to different people. And that's probably a good thing, right? You have to adjust your diet to your individual circumstance, but you have to have a reasonable starting point. And, if you're a person who has already paid attention to their diet, good for you. I just started working with a gentleman a couple of weeks ago who, when I did his diet review, which is like when I take on a client, this very first thing we look at is their diet. Like while we're waiting to get their lab data back, we look at their diet and we just initiate a diet strategy. And this guy had done a lot of good work on his own. And I really had very few things to tell him. Okay, we did have a few things that we needed to tweak, but he had done 80% of the work. Right? There are people who start out with me and it's 100% overhaul. We're just going to go in a completely different direction. Some people it's, a tweak here and there. And some people it's, okay, you're 50% of the way there. Let's change these things. And then you can deal with the idea of, organic vegetables and grass-fed and wild-caught. And these can certainly make a difference. There are some lucky people that don't need to pay attention to that for whatever reason. But there are others who if I don't eat organic vegetables and fruit, I feel worse. Understanding that the nomenclature of, designating something as organic doesn't mean that it's free of pesticides and chemicals. It just means less. So high diet quality is important. Now, what they did in these studies is they essentially looked at people and looked at these 5 low-risk habits and lifestyles, and they figured out who's doing one of these, who's doing 2 of these, who's doing 4 of these, who's doing all 5. And the interesting thing is it relates to longevity, is that according to the data, particularly in that study from the journal Circulation, that people who adhere to all of these 0 low-risk lifestyle factors at the age of 50 have significantly increased longevity compared to those who don't. Let me say it another way. For women who follow none of the low-risk factors, they only live 29 years beyond the age of 50. So they live to the age of 79. For men who follow none of these low-risk lifestyle factors, they live 25 and a half years past the age of 50. So let's just call it 75. So the men and women who don't follow any of these low-risk lifestyle factors live to about 75 to 79 years old. But if you flip that around and look at the data and look at the people who adopted all 5 of the low risk factors, these women live 43 years. They live to 93. And men live to 87, 88. In other words, when you combine men and women together who are all following all of the low risk lifestyle factors that we just talked about, they live an extra 13 years or so right off the bat. Right? Just by cleaning up the biggest of the big rocks. And that's not even talking or thinking about the things that I do in clinical practice or this whole world of longevity and biohacking. And the message that comes out of this is that ignoring these baseline big rocks first habits places your system into a chronic, oxidatively stressed, inflamed catabolic state where your body aggressively resists normal physiological function. So let's say that you clean up your big rocks first and you're like, yeah, I'm smoking and I should stop. I don't have a healthy BMI. Let me do my best to lose weight and build muscle and so on. Let's say that you clean these up and you feel confident that your buying back about 13 years of life. Does this guarantee that you're going to have a satisfactory quality of life? And the answer is, of course, it doesn't, right? And you may have heard the term health span now, which is probably a preferable term than longevity. Health span is the idea of how many years can you live, say past 50, and be healthy, not be saddled with disease and medications and so on. But the reality is that Americans live sicker longer, right? We live longer, but we failed to conquer these chronic illnesses, despite all the promises that we've been given year after year, decade after decade, that comes mostly from the pharmaceutical industry, of course, right? We're merely extending the years that we spend surviving with severe morbidity, disease states like diabetes and cardiovascular disease and cognitive decline and developing cancer. I'm sure you've heard these stats before, but the US ranks first in the world in healthcare expenditure. We spend about a little over $9,000 per person per year on healthcare. And the vast majority of that is spent in the last 6 months or so of life. Yet, despite focusing billions of money on drug discovery and disease treatment, rather than focusing on the big rocks first, despite spending over $9,000 per person, more than any other country in the world, we rank 53rd in the world in life expectancy. And we have some of the highest disease rates along the way. And so when someone ignores the big rocks, the simple, stupid stuff, the obvious stuff, they live to an average age of about 75, but they're destined to spend most of those extra years with really poor quality of life. And they spend the last of those 5 years, those extra years that they get beyond 50, they spend the last 5 of those years simply surviving in states of chronic illness, trapped by cancer, heart disease, neurodegeneration, dementia, type 2 diabetes, and so on. So, we know unhealthy habits, of course, they shorten your life. They ensure that a portion, maybe the highest portion of your remaining life is trapped in some degree of disability, capped off by 5 years of suffering with true disease. Let me just recap. Because conventional care excels at using drugs to artificially keep failing organ systems working without reversing root causes, unhealthier people are simply forced to live longer with major disabilities. And if you don't adhere to these foundational habits, listen to this, not adhering to these foundational habits accounts for a staggering 61% of all-cause premature death. It accounts for 72% of cardiovascular deaths and 52% of all cancer deaths. This is why we talk about these things being preventable diseases, because we can modify the path that leads up to the outcome. Now, if we go back to, the recent news about Bryan Johnson, I seriously doubt that he smokes and drinks, and I can't imagine he eats junk food along with his plant-based diet. And I can't imagine he doesn't exercise. And I know he's lean, right? I've seen pictures of him. He has adequate muscle and he doesn't carry a lot of body fat. So he's got all the big rocks in place. And so how does a man like that, who handles the big rocks first and spends millions of dollars a year on biohacking, how does he get diagnosed with an autoimmune disease? Or in other words, if these 5 healthy, low-risk lifestyle factors are so powerful, why do people still crash and burn? Why is it when they try to DIY their own health by maybe eating a generic clean diet or, pushing through an exercise program, why doesn't it work? Well, one would be an idea that I floated in a recent episode called metabolic reprogramming, right? The longer that you are unwell, the more efficiently your cells memorize their dysfunction. This is one of the reasons why it takes so long to undo the damage of smoking. It's because your cells remember. Your biology undergoes negative plasticity. It reprograms itself to stay inflamed, to stay in a state of dysfunction and keeping you locked in states of energy failure. And that's why I think it's so important to look at your path forward through the lens of the 3-stage journey that I talked about in my last couple of episodes, right? True resolution requires a systematic, high engagement strategy. And the first step is restoring the foundation of healthy metabolism, identifying whatever your root cause disruptors are using personalized but deep functional diagnostics to try to get you to the point where you're about 75% better. And at that point, the second goal is to maintain that progress and to cement it, kind of bake it into your system. And in one of my last episodes, I talked about spending enough time under protocol, practicing the things that work for you so that you can unwind that negative plasticity and you can build metabolic stability and resilience. And then and only then do longevity strategies make sense, or I should say biohacking. Because even along the way, as you're working through that first stage of restoring healthy metabolic foundations and then working to maintain that and to give your body time to reprogram itself. All of these things are affecting your longevity, particularly if you start engaging in one or more of these healthy habits and lifestyles that you're not currently doing. Remember, when you do those things as opposed to don't do those things, you buy yourself about 13 years of life. We want to make sure that those are good years and that you don't suffer for 5 years at the end dealing with these diseases. All right, I've been on my soapbox long enough for today. I think that you should ground yourself in a reality check. Stop spending so much money employing advanced longevity shortcuts and biohacking protocols while your baseline foundation is frozen in a state of negative reprogramming. You cannot out-hack a broken and fractured physiology. Right? Crafting wellness is not the same as managing disease with a pill or some kind of a shortcut. It requires finding your root cause disruptors, building your metabolic resistance, and then moving step by step through a real health journey. And that's why I basically reformatted my clinic and my practice years ago to operate on a low volume, high engagement framework. Like I don't farm out my clients to staff that handle diet stuff, like health coaches that are not clinician trained. I don't use autopilot cookie cutter templates to make it easy for me to see 30 people in a day. I work directly with all of my clients. I handle everything. I look at their unique medical history. I do all the deep functional metrics and tests, and I design a personalized journey and path back to vitality and try to do everything I can to help your body maintain that once we accomplish it. So if you are ready to stop majoring in the minors and finally fix the root causes that are driving your chronic symptoms, you can call me. My number, my email, everything should be in the episode description, or you can go to my website. Also should be a link there. I have a contact card on the website. You can reach out to me and say, hey, I think I want to talk to you. All right, guys, thanks for listening and enjoying this obvious, simple, stupid review of some of the things that can make the biggest difference. And hopefully you don't need to make any changes, that you're already doing these things. But if not, that's where you start. And if that's not working for you, you know where I am. All right, we'll see you next time. This podcast is for general informational and educational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine in any form or capacity. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of the information in this podcast or any materials associated with or linked to the podcast is at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional and personalized medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment, and listeners should not disregard or delay obtaining proper medical advice when a health condition exists and warrants that. And finally, functional medicine is not intended or designed to treat disease, but rather is a natural approach to support restoring health and wellness. The use of diet and lifestyle modifications and nutritional supplementation is supportive or adjunctive care.